A bird's eye view. Obviously, there's a lot of detail in the book, which I'm not going to cover and you have to read. So I'm going to try to address in particular the questions that you answer in your assignments. Who were the books written to? And at this point, I'm obviously grouping Thessalonians 1 and 2 together. It's addressed to the church in Thessaloniki. Okay, we say Thessalonica in English. And that is a town still in Greece, in the area of Greece that is known as Macedonia, the place where Alexander the Great came from. Okay, it's located on the Bay of Therm, the northeast corner of the Aegean Sea. There you can see it over there. So during Paul's time, it was actually the capital of Macedonia, had an estimated population as high as 200,000, which in those days was a lot. And the majority of the inhabitants were Greeks, with a mixture of other ethnic groups, including Jews. So hence why there was a synagogue there. The books are obviously named after the Thessalonians, the inhabitants of Thessaloniki, the Greek name for the city. It was founded in 315 BC by Cassander of Macedon, and it was named after his wife. And as you can see, her name was Thessaloniki, and she was actually the half-sister of Alexander the Great. Just a brief history of the city. It remained in the Greek hands until 168 BC, and then the Romans came along and took possession of it. And it was made the capital of the Roman province of Macedonia in 148 BC. It was the second largest and wealthiest city of the Byzantine Empire after Constantinople, which was the capital. And when it was conquered by the Ottoman Turks in 1430, about 1/5 of the city's population was enslaved. It passed to Greece in 1912, and the modern town is currently the second largest city in the country. It has over 1 million inhabitants, and it's still the capital of the region of Macedonia. So you're talking about a very prominent city here. The author, they were both written by the Apostle Paul. He does mention Timothy, and in some versions it says Silvanus. It is actually Silvanus. I know the Niv says Silas, but that's because Silvanus is just the longer form of Silas. So it is the same person. Nothing to that there. The fact that Paul mentions them doesn't necessarily mean they co-wrote it with him. So it's a possibility, but it could be that he was just saying greetings from Paul, Silas, and Timothy because they happen to be with him. Certainly, Paul is the one who's responsible in particular for the content. The language, no surprise there, they were written in Koine Greek. And according to the scholars, they say that Paul is clearly fluent in the language, as the style of the Greek is impeccable. So Paul was born in a Roman city, Tarsus, and he was a Roman citizen, and he was clearly a Hellenized Jew, because although he was trained in the tradition of the Hebrews, he has very good Greek. Where do they fit in the Bible? The 8th and the 9th books, in the Pauline epistles, in the New Testament. About the author, Saul was educated in Jerusalem. So remember, he was born in Tarsus, which made him a Roman citizen because it was part of the Roman Empire. And he was sent to Jerusalem to be educated by Gamaliel, who is actually one of the most noted teachers of Jewish law and history. You'll find that the Jews know about Gamaliel, and he had a very good reputation. Being a Roman citizen, he had a Latin name of Paulus as well. In the Greek, it's Paulos, similar as well. And so that's why, as he moves more to the Gentiles, he's no longer called Saul or Shaul. His Hebrew name, he becomes known as Paulus. You should know this. Paul persecuted the church originally, and on the road to Damascus, he has this amazing experience where he encounters the risen Christ, struck blind. After 3 days, his sight is restored by a Christian named Ananias. And thereafter, he begins to preach that Jesus is the Messiah and the Son of God. And even though he was not one of the 12, he was appointed by Christ as an apostle and is regarded as one of the most important figures of the apostolic age. his contribution just to the New Testament and to the doctrine is profound. He was a man who was very gifted and very, had great revelations from God. Approximately half of the book of Acts deals with his life. 14 of the 27 books, I'm including Hebrews there. I believe Hebrews was included. Some people question that because the author doesn't mention themselves. We'll get to that later. And so, even according to Wikipedia, which normally, when it talks about the books of the Bible, has a lot of nonsense in it. I like this excerpt. They say, Paul's influence in Christian thought and practice has been characterized as being profound as it is pervasive, among that of many other apostles and missionaries involved in the spread of the Christian faith. I mean, he was the man who brought the gospel into Europe. So he undertook at least 3 missionary journeys. There are some who believe he might have done one after the book of Acts, but he planted several Christian churches in Asia Minor and Europe. About the possible co-authors, Timothy was from the city of Lystra, which is in modern-day Turkey. He had a Greek father, and his mother was a Jewess who had become a Christian. And clearly his grandmother, Lois, was also a believer. And we know that he was acquainted with the scriptures since childhood. Paul met him around AD 52 on his second missionary journey, and he joins Paul and Silas on their journey to Macedonia. So here we see the trio already, Paul, Silas, and Timothy. Paul became his mentor and later wrote 2 letters to him, 1 and 2 Timothy. Silas has a Latin name, making it likely that he was a Hellenistic Jew. And like Paul, a Roman citizen, because you find that when they put in prison in Philippi, they say, we are Roman citizens. So the implication is Silas was as well. He's first mentioned in Acts 15, where after the Jerusalem Council, he and Judas Barsabas were selected by the church elders to return with Paul and Barnabas to Antioch. He's mentioned as being a leader at the Antioch church, and he accompanied Paul on his second missionary journey. Remember, the first one, Paul went with Barnabas and John Mark. Peter later describes Silas as a faithful brother as well. So he was well known to the early church. And probably the best known anecdote about Silas is him and Paul, being beaten in Philippi and then subsequently singing songs of praise and the earthquake breaking their chains. Right, so the Thessalonian church, they have just traced the first part of Paul's missionary journey, which makes him end up in Thessaloniki. Paul visits the synagogue about AD 50, and he plants the seeds for the first church. Silas and Timothy are accompanying him. And so the trio were well known to the Thessalonian church. Hence, there's no surprise that when Paul writes the letters, he uses names of people that they know. We're told in Acts that when Paul went there, he went for 3 Sabbaths into the synagogue and reasons with them from the scriptures, explaining and proving that the Messiah had to suffer and rise from the dead. In other words, pointing out to them that you don't just have a conquering Messiah, you have a suffering Messiah. This Jesus I'm proclaiming to you is the Messiah, he said. We are told that some of the Jews are persuaded and join them, and also a large number of God-fearing Greeks and quite a few prominent women. But there were some Jews who didn't like his message, and it says they rounded up some bad characters from the marketplace. So apparently that was where the bad characters hung around, and they formed a mob and they started a riot, and they rushed to Jason's house in search of Paul and Silas in order to bring them out to the crowd. They didn't find them, so they dragged Jason, who's been sheltering them, and some other believers before the city officials, and they say these men have caused trouble all over the world, and now they've come here, and Jason welcomed them, and they defy Caesar's decrees, saying that there's another king called Jesus. Okay, I'm going to skip over some of this because this is more about Acts. The point is that subsequently Paul and Silas leave and they go to Berea. And they preached there as well, but it turns out that some of the troublemakers from Thessaloniki followed them, and then they caused trouble there again, and Paul has to leave and travel to Athens alone, and Silas and Timothy later joined him in Corinth, where they all preached together. So let's just look at some of the things about 1 Thessalonians. Acts 18:12-17 mentions a guy called Gallio during the end of Paul's stay in Corinth. So remember, I just showed you how Paul, shortly after his visit there, ends up in Corinth. And that's nice because it allows us to get some fairly accurate dates here. A lot of the dates, you'll notice, depending on the source you get slightly different dates. Don't be too concerned about that because most of the dates are estimates. Be concerned when they try to date them decades and decades later, because then that's normally the liberal viewpoint, and they normally try to attribute it to someone else as well. Okay, the Delphi inscription dated Gallio's proconsulship to a very specific time, 51 to 52 AD. And so the majority of New Testament scholars believe 1 Thessalonians was written during Paul's 18-month stay in Corinth, that I told you about there, on his second missionary journey. And so they dated from 49 to 51. You saw how he left a bit in haste, gets to Berea, he's not there too long and he's chased out. In passing, he goes to Athens and then he goes to Corinth. Now, obviously, when he was in Corinth, he thought, there was more stuff he needed to tell the Thessalonians about that he'd like to have told them, and so he writes his letter. And that's how we believe it came about. It was probably his second epistles. Some believe it was his first, written 2 years after the letter to the Galatians. But it was one of his early ones. It's one of the few where he's not in prison. And so this I put together. I won't go through all these dates, but if you want to consult the notes, as I say, you will find differences. Maybe even in your notes you'll find differences, but not big a deal. I tried to get the general feel there for the different books, and I wanted to have it all in one slide. So there you have it, the date range when most of the books in the New Testament were likely written. That's the majority opinion. You're going to get some people who you will differ, but most not. Okay, the book is accepted by virtually all New Testament scholars. There were some radical critics of some Dutch schools in the last century, but no one really takes them seriously anymore. The reason is because we found 1 Thessalonian in Marcion's canon. Marcion, by the way, he was actually a heretic. He was a Gnostic heretic, but the good thing about him is he put together a canon. He cut out a lot of the books he didn't like. He only used the Gospel of Luke because he didn't like the Jews. And so he had a bit of a butchered copy of Luke, and he liked all the letters of Paul. So we've got it in a very early canon from Marcion, but it's also quoted in name by Irenaeus, one of the guys I mention often in the 2nd century, very reputable church father. Clement of Alexandria and Tertullian, all reputable guys, quote the book. Perhaps even Polycarp alludes to it when he speaks of Paul's letters to the Philippians. Further, it is also found in most ancient manuscripts, including the Old Latin, the Old Syriac, and 46, that's just an abbreviation for one of the old manuscripts. Remember when I told you about the early translations, Latin Syriac, which suggests that it was fully accepted from a very early period. So it's very difficult even for the liberals to try to attack it and say, well, Paul didn't write it. Why did he write it? The main reason was misunderstandings about the Church of Christ. And he wanted to clear it up. But he also gives some instruction on holy living. There's a broad outline, which I'm not going to read through. So the first 3 chapters are about Paul longing to visit the church, not being able to because Satan stopped them. How he cared for them and was encouraged to hear about how they had been, and then he prays for them. The main theme, as I said, is Jesus' second coming. When he returns, the dead who have believed in Christ will rise and join to meet the living in the air. Wonderful promises we have there. Unbelievers will experience God's wrath. Believers will inherit salvation. And in preparation for that great day, Christians are called to be holy and blameless. God, who is faithful, will produce in them the holiness he requires. He points out that God's going to pour out his wrath on those who reject the gospel, that Jesus' death and resurrection are the basis for the Christian hope, and that we as Christians are destined not for wrath, but for salvation when Christ returns. And then in chapter 4, he instructs the believers in Thessaloniki on how to live a holy life in Christ Jesus. And he goes on to instruct them of a misconception they had. He tells them that the people who have died in Christ Jesus will also go on to heaven when he comes back. So there seems to have been a concern that if you died, that maybe somehow you missed out on the second coming, and he clears that up as well. And the book ends with final instructions of living the Christian life. Key verses, again, I'm not going to read that to you for the sake of time, but there's 4. Well, is it 14, 15, 16, 17? Yes. Great words about the resurrection, the trumpet call of God, a very well-known passage. Here's one I will read to you. Rejoice always, pray continually, give thanks in all circumstances, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus. What a verse. If you can put that into practice, you're well on your way. And so the book can be practically applied to many life situations. It gives us the confidence as Christians that dead or alive, when Christ comes back, we'll be together. He says the dead will be raised first, and we are alive will be caught up to meet them. So there's going to be no penalization besides a few microseconds. You know, the dead in Christ rise first, and in the twinkling of an eye, we caught up as well. It assures us as Christians we won't receive God's wrath, instructs us on how to walk the Christian life daily. And he points out that joy, especially in suffering, and this is a common theme in the New Testament, is the mark of a Christian. Christians should live lives of complete holiness. Faith, hope, and love are essential traits of the Christian. And Christians must never ignore the responsibility to work. He makes it clear that we should have a good work ethic, not be lazy. And so, 2 Thessalonians, let's have a look at that very briefly as well. The purpose of writing. It appears they still had some misconceptions about the day of the Lord, because now people had come along and said, well, it's already come. So they also apparently had some preterists in their congregation, or, you know, living there, and said, Jesus has already come. You guys missed it. Okay. And they were being persecuted badly, and Paul wrote to clear up some misconceptions and to comfort them. It's believed that it was written very shortly after the first one, in AD 51 to 52. But as is common practice, modern liberal scholars will question whether Paul even wrote the book, and they attempt to late date it. And I don't even look at stuff like that. In fact, it normally irritates me because we have these guys 2,000 years later who seem to know so much more about what happened then than the people who lived closer to the time. Again, it's found in Marcion's canon. Remember the heretic? He liked Paul at least. And in the Muratorian canon, there was a Christian canon, but it is again quoted, named by Irenaeus. He lived in the 2nd century. It was apparently known to Ignatius, very early guy, 1st century, Justin Martyr, and Polycarp. Polycarp was actually a disciple of the Apostle John. Further, it is found in most ancient manuscripts, including the Old Latin, that's even before the Vulgate, the Old Syriac, and 46, suggesting its full acceptance from a very early period. Paul drew attention to the letter's authenticity by signing it himself. He specifically says, Paul, write this greeting with my own hand. So he actually went to pains to show I'm writing this letter, and yet we have people today say, well, he didn't write it. So apparently it was written by a forger who was pretending to be Paul, who was then telling us all that we shouldn't lie. Okay. I'm lying, but you guys mustn't. Okay, there's the broad outline. Paul opens the letter praising the church for their faithfulness and their perseverance in the face of persecution. They were now faced with a false teaching originating from a message or a letter purporting to be from Paul. So they were in confusion because it appears there was a letter which people claimed to be from Paul. So that's why he goes to great pains, say, I'm writing this with my own hand. He was trying to make sure that they knew this is really from me. And this message or letter purportedly said that the day of the Lord had already come. And they were trying to say, well, it's actually Paul who said that. And Paul writes to them and says, it wasn't me who said that. He reminds them that it will not come unless the apostasy comes first and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction. So he gives us quite a good amount of information on the Antichrist, on him setting up his image in the temple. It's wonderful. He puts it in a lot plainer terms, and perhaps we get it in Revelation, which is very symbolic. Paul speaks clearly about this man of lawlessness sitting in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God. And so a lot of we know about the Antichrist we can actually get from 2 Thessalonians. Wonderful teaching from a prophetic point of view. The man of lawlessness will deceive all those who've rejected the gospel. Jesus will judge them when he returns. God's righteous judgment will be completed when Jesus returns. Unbelievers will be condemned and believers will be saved. Christians will share Christ's glory. Some people believe that possibility, the reason why Paul's keeping on rebuking them for not working, is that because they thought the day of the Lord, had already come. Possibly it might be linked to why, the same way you sometimes get people who stop working now because they think the day of the Lord is imminent. More likely, lazy Christians may have been exploiting the generosity of wealthier Christians in order to avoid work. And he points out that Christians must not take advantage of the charity of fellow Christians. So although we are told to assist fellow Christians, we do help people. We know there's a difference between a person who's not willing to work and a person who's, who can't find work. They're willing to work, but they're unable to find. And it appears that the case here was people who were just lazy. They didn't want to work. They were able-bodied. They could have worked, but they didn't want to. They were lazy, and Paul rebukes them for that. In contrast to the warm emotional tone of 1 Thessalonians, he's got a bit of more of blunt commands, and he addresses their bad behavior and bad thinking. This letter is noteworthy for Paul's tough-mindedness in predicting judgment on the ungodly and in rebuking church members who behave and think incorrectly. Still, there is a regular swing back and forth between reproof and warm encouragement. And again, I won't read all of these verses. 2 Thessalonians 3:10, I'll pick that one at the bottom. When we were with you, we gave you this rule: the one who is unwilling to work shall not eat. See, not the one who's unable to, the one who's unwilling to. So we as Christians need to be willing to work when employment is offered us. And so the practical application, it's filled with information that explains the end times. It exhorts us not to be idle and to work for what we have. And there are also some great prayers that can be an example for us now to pray for other believers today.